Are the trends you've been speaking about in U.S. universities, do you think they're responsible for a lot of what's coming out of the academic left, mainly postmodernism? Do you think that has a particular place in the doctrinal system, mainly people wanting to be subversive but not rock the boat, or do you think there's some other explanation for that?
Well, you know, individuals have their own reasons, and you have to look and ask why they're doing things. But if you look at the phenomena as a whole, its effect has been, I think the effect is pretty clear. It allows people to take a very radical stance, you know, more radical than thou, but to be completely dissociated from anything that's happening for many reasons. One reason is nobody can understand a word they're saying, you know, so they're already dissociated. It's kind of like a private lingo, and it's very, you know, there's a lot of material reward that comes from it. Like if you're part of that system, you can run around to conferences and get big professorships and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of sort of conventional material reward, and it has this very radical look to it, so you feel, you know, well, let me just give you an example. I gave a talk a couple days, last Saturday, at Birzeit University, you know, the Palestinian university at the West Bank. And it was a, you know, like everywhere, big mass audience, political talk, mostly criticizing the Palestinian Authority, because I was in, you know, you always tell people what they don't want to hear. So I want to criticize Israel, I do it on the other side of the border. The audience, most of the audience, you know, very supportive, and they liked it and they understood it. The guys with the jackets and ties were pretty angry, but that's normal. However, as I left with an Arab friend of mine who organized it, he's actually an Arab, he's an Israeli Arab who's a member of the Knesset parliament, but an old kind of good guy. He sort of he was sitting in the back of the, and as we walked out, he kind of laughed, and he told me that you know, he said most of the, especially younger people, liked it a lot, but he heard one really critical comment from a young woman faculty member who sort of liked the general political thrust of it, but told him it was very naive. And I said, you know, why was it naive? And he laughed, and he said, well, it's because you said that people do things on moral grounds, and you talked about truth, okay? And that's old-fashioned nonsense. You know, that's kind of this old Enlightenment stuff. We know perfectly well that nobody does it. I mean, I talked about how apartheid was overthrown, you know, and how it was necessary to have splits inside the white society, which there were. If the white society had been unified, they would have smashed the ANC. But there were splits from the inside, and basically on moral grounds. People didn't want to tolerate it, and that was quite important. Something, you know, talked about that. Well, that's naive, because nobody does anything on moral grounds. All power plays, you know, read Foucault and so on and so forth, if you can understand it. And truth is kind of like an old-fashioned concept, you know, there's no truth and so on and so forth. Yeah, that stuff goes on all over. I mean, the next day I gave a talk at an Israeli university, and then it was critical of Israel and the United States, and talk about the Palestinians. And there were commentators, and one of the commentators was the dean, and he, you know, he hated it, of course, and a historian. And he also said it was naive, because I was talking as if there's an objectivity in history. I was running through the history of what happened and saying how you should interpret what's going on now in those terms. It is complete naive. I mean, everybody knows there's no objectivity and there's no truth, and it's this narrative and that narrative and so on and so forth. That's very convenient. It sounds very radical, you know, and it's extremely convenient. You can beat people over the head with perfect, you know, self-confidence, because there's no reality anyway, and it's just their narrative and your narrative. In the third world, it's particularly grotesque in my opinion. It's bad enough here. I don't like it here or other rich countries. But when you get to third world countries, it's really grotesque, because you know, there the separation of the radical intelligentsia from popular struggle is much more, you know, it shows much more dramatically. I mean, people are much poorer and they're suffering much more, and these guys are usually very rich, in fact, often, and it's ugly. But I think it has served a function. I don't want to say that the people who are involved in it necessarily do it for this reason. In fact, I know extremely good people who are very active and, you know, I respect and like and so on, who are right in this stuff. I don't know why, but means something to them. But as a general phenomenon, I think that's the way it's worked. It's worked as a way of insulating sectors of a kind of radical intelligentsia from popular movements and actual activism, and it served as an instrument of power. I suspect that's the reason why it's so readily tolerated in the universities. I mean, it's all over the place, in the third world as well, because of the function it serves.
I have to say that a lot of postmodern work I just don't understand, so I can't comment on it. It seems to me some exercise by intellectuals who are talking to each other in very obscure ways, and I can't follow it, and I don't know if anybody else can. Postmodern views of science, by and large, have been pretty embarrassing, I think. There's some interesting work on this. There's a book by two physicists, Jean Bricmont and Alan Sokal, both of whom happen to be political radicals, just running through, it's mostly Paris postmodernism, what postmodern commentators have said about science. And it is really embarrassing. I mean, to the extent you can understand it. I mean, on the other hand, there is a point. I mean, insofar as they say that everything that people do is some kind of social construction, depends on the historical context, cultural context, that part's true. I don't know if you need the whole postmodern baggage to say those things. My feeling is not. At least, personally, I haven't seen anything that it doesn't seem to me has to be said in anything but monosyllables. It looks, insofar as I understand it, it's pretty straightforward. And I get the feeling that it's kind of, I mean, there isn't a drive among intellectuals to make things look difficult. It's a kind of self-protection. I mean, if what I'm doing can be done by, the guy who's repairing my furnace, okay, then who am I, and then there's those physicists over there who talk complicated things and have to, and I don't understand them, so I'd like to be like them, That drive is clearly there, and I think it should be resisted. I mean, if we can say things simply so that people can understand them, we should.
Like anything that we understand about at all with regard to things as complicated as human affairs, the answers are pretty trivial. If they're not trivial, we don't understand it. There is a category of intellectuals who are undoubtedly perfectly sincere, who, if you look at it from the outside, what they're actually doing is using polysyllabic words and complicated constructions, which apparently they seem to understand because they talk to each other. Most of the time I can't understand what the heck they're talking about. Even people are supposed to be in my field. It's all very inflated and, a lot of prestige and so on. That has a terrible effect in the third world. In the first world, the rich countries, it doesn't really matter that much. So if a lot of nonsense goes on in the Paris cafes or the Yale comparative literature department, well, okay. On the other hand, in the third world, popular movements really need serious intellectuals to participate. And if they're all ranting postmodern absurdities, well, they're gone. I mean, I've seen real examples, could give them to you. But so there is that category. And it's considered very left-wing and very advanced and so on and so forth. Well, some of what appears in it actually makes sense. But when you reproduce it in monosyllables, it turns out to be truisms. So yes, it is perfectly true that if you look at scientists in the West, they're mostly men. And it's perfectly true that women have had a hard time breaking into scientific fields. And it's perfectly true that there are institutional factors determining how science proceeds that reflect power structures. I mean, all of this can be described literally in monosyllables, and it turns out to be truisms when you...
Clearly, yeah.
Okay. On the other hand, you don't get to be a respected intellectual by presenting truisms in monosyllables. Now, a lot of the left criticism... So when the left, so-called left criticism, I don't consider it left, when the left criticism, so-called, happens to be accurate, well, okay, that's fine. So if you point out a lot of things, just like what I mentioned, there are a lot of them, no, that's fine. Point it out, everybody can understand it, you take a look, you see it's true, and so on. On the other hand, a lot of the so-called left criticism seems to be pure nonsense. In fact, that's been demonstrated conclusively. So there's a very important book by Jean Bricon and Alan Sokal, I forget what it's called, Dangerous Illusions or something, where they simply go through they happen to concentrate on Paris, which is the center of the rot, but it's all over. And they go through the most respected French intellectuals and run through what they say about science. And, you know, it is so embarrassing that you kind of cringe when you read it. Actually, sometimes, one of my most striking ones is one of the very few who actually is a scientist and knows something about science. Latour has a background in science and philosophy of science. They go through an article of his, and I think I'm remembering it correctly, in which somebody in France or somewhere had discovered that one of the pharaohs had died of tuberculosis. And they did it by, analysis of whatever, DNA or something. Latour wrote an article ridiculing this, because he said it's totally absurd.
Because nobody had talked about it.
Yeah, tuberculosis was only discovered in the 19th century. How could and everything's a social construction, and
therefore it wasn't constructed yet.
So it didn't happen. I mean, it's kind of at the level of Bush and Chirac,
yeah.
But it's taken very seriously, and this is considered very leftist.
But one point to look at, I think, is that the description of intellectuals, the description of journalists, and now the description of this sector of part of what calls itself the left, you have something similar going on, even though the price is much lower. You have those guys sitting in the air-conditioned rooms bombing the hell out of the world for their careers, for their status, because of their reflexive lessons that they've learned. And then over here you have people who are in literary criticism or whatever field they might be in, who are also completely divorced from reality or obscuring it or dolling it up for similar reasons. Of course, the price is much less. I mean, it's high, but it's...
In the third world,
yeah.
it's high.
But it's
in
still...
the rich countries, it's just a pain in the neck.
Still not like bombing the world.
Yeah. I think
but it's the same phenomenon.
They're hard to understand. I mean, they're nice people. A lot of them are friends. And if you look at what's happening, I think it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on. I mean, suppose you're a literary scholar at some elite university, or anthropologist or whatever. I mean, if you do your work seriously, that's fine, but it's not very. I mean, you don't get any big prizes for it. On the other hand, you take a look over in the rest of the university, and you got these guys in the physics department and the math department, and they have all kind of complicated theories, which of course we can't understand, but they seem to understand them, and they have principles, and they deduce complicated things from the principles, and they do experiments, and they find either they work or they don't work, and that's really impressive stuff. So I want to be like that too. So I want to have a theory in literary, in the humanities, literary criticism, anthropology, and so on. There's a field called theory. We're just like the physicists. They talk incomprehensibly, we can talk incomprehensibly. They have big words, we'll have big words. They draw, far-reaching conclusions, we'll draw far-reaching conclusions. We're just as prestigious as they are. Now, if they say, well, look, we're doing real science and you guys aren't, that's white, male, sexist, bourgeois, whatever the answer is. How are we any different from them? Okay, that's appealing. And there are other things that went on. Remember that a lot of this stuff comes from Paris. And interesting things were happening in Paris in the 1970s. The French intellectuals were the last group of intellectuals in the world who were dedicated, overwhelmingly, not 100%, but it was very standard and respected to be a dedicated Stalinist and Maoist. Okay, by the mid-70s, that was getting to be a pretty hard position to uphold. So what you had, if you take a look at what happened, is there was a sudden shift. People who had been flaming Maoists and Stalinists suddenly became the first people in the world to have discovered the Gulag. and went on a tear about how everyone else supports, Stalinist and Maoist atrocities, and we're France, of course, so we have to be in front of everyone. So therefore, we've exposed it, and now it was called the New Philosophy, or New Philosophers or something. And it went over all kinds. I remember meeting, I won't mention names because it's embarrassing, one of the leading French cultural theorists who happened to visit me around 1974, and she was a flaming Maoist. A couple of years later, she was one of the first people to have understood, to have, discovered Stalinist and Maoist atrocities. Well, okay, when you went through that transition, you got to do something else. How are you going to be, on the front pages? Okay. Along comes the invention of post-structuralism.